The text message came at 7:43 inches the morning. Not a phone call, a text from my daughter-in-law. The equipment vendor is asking about the final payment. Did Kyle forward you the wire details? No, good morning. No, how are you doing, Martin? Just a question about money, the same way you'd text a billing department, not the man who had put $310,000 into the restaurant she was running. I read it twice, standing at my kitchen counter in Brentwood, Tennessee, the coffee still brewing behind me and the backyard still dark. I had retired from 33 years as a civil engineer the previous spring. My wife, Ellen, had passed 2.5 years before that, a little over a year after her diagnosis. I had sold the house in Franklin where we raised our son and moved somewhere smaller, somewhere I could manage on my own without too many rooms, reminding me of what used to fill them. The new house had a good yard, though. Ellen would have done something beautiful with it. I typed back that I would look into it and set the phone face down on the counter. The question I had been meaning to ask my son was a different one entirely. I had been trying to reach Kyle for 11 days. His restaurant, a farm-to-table concept he had named Millstone Kitchen, had been in development for nearly 2 years. He had come to me in the fall of the year before with a business plan he had put together himself, 42 pages, spiral-bound, with photographs of the space and projected revenue charts, and a section at the back about sourcing from local Tennessee farms. He had driven up to Brentwood on a Sunday afternoon and spread it across the dining room table and talked for 3 hours. I had listened to every word. I had asked questions. I had gone through the numbers the way an engineer goes through load calculations, looking for the weak points. The numbers were not perfect, but the concept was sound, and my son had thought it through seriously. What made me write the check was not the business plan. I had funded things before that had not worked out, and I was realistic about risk. What made me write the check was the look on Kyle's face when he talked about the kitchen. He is 37 years old, and he has his mother's eyes. And when he talked about the menu and the sourcing relationships and the kind of place he wanted to build, he looked the way Ellen used to look when she was planning a garden, like a person who had found exactly the thing they were supposed to be doing. I wrote the check in 2 installments, the first $200,000 in November, the remaining $110,000 the following March when the build-out ran longer than projected, which I had anticipated. I did not ask for an ownership stake. I did not ask for my name on the sign. I asked my son to keep me informed, to treat me as his father, and not just as a source of capital, and to call me on Sunday afternoons the way he always had. For the first several months, he did. He would walk me through the contractor updates and send photos of the progress. The tile work in the dining room, the hood installation in the kitchen, the bar they had built from reclaimed barnwood. I drove down to Nashville twice to see the space in person, and both times Kyle walked me through every corner of it with the kind of pride that is good to see in a son. Then his wife took over the finances. Vanessa has a business degree from Vanderbilt and a way of organizing things that Kyle has always admired and occasionally been overwhelmed by. She is sharp and efficient, and she manages the details of their life the way a project manager manages a schedule, with precision and very little room for anything that has not been accounted for. When Kyle told me she would be handling the restaurant's books and vendor relationships going forward, he presented it the way he presents things he has already decided, after the fact, in a tone that leaves little room for a different opinion. I had no objection in principle. Running a restaurant is not easy, and Vanessa had more relevant experience than Kyle did on the operational side. I told him I thought it made sense as long as the Sunday calls kept coming. They did not keep coming. The first few dropped off because of the build-out push. Then there was the soft launch, which came and went without much fanfare. Kyle had mentioned it in a text. Then the calls went from weekly to every other week to a check-in once a month that usually lasted 8 minutes and covered nothing I did not already know from whatever Kyle had posted online. The invoices started coming from Vanessa, forwarded without commentary. Just the document attached to an email with a one-line note. Vendor payment attached. Please wire by Friday. I paid them without complaint because the bills were consistent with what I had agreed to cover during the build-out phase, and I did not want to create friction over process when Kyle was clearly under significant pressure. But I had begun to feel something that I want to describe carefully because I think it matters. It was not anger, not yet. It was the specific feeling of a man who has been moved from one room to another without being asked. You are still in the house. No one has said anything unkind, but you understand, without anyone telling you directly, that the room you are in now is not the room where the important conversations happen. The morning Vanessa texted about the equipment vendor. I had been trying to reach Kyle for 11 days. The calls went through, but he did not answer. He responded to 2 of my texts with short replies. Busy week, talk soon, the kind of messages that mean nothing and are designed to mean nothing. On the 12th day, I drove to Nashville. I knew the address of Millstone Kitchen from the documents. It was on a side street in East Nashville, a neighborhood that had changed considerably since the years when Ellen and I used to drive through it on the way to her college roommate's house. I found parking on the street and walked toward the building. I stopped on the sidewalk across the street. The restaurant was open, not under construction, not in soft launch. Open, operating, with a hand-lettered chalkboard sign on the sidewalk listing the lunch specials and a small line of people waiting at the host stand visible through the front glass. There were plants in the window boxes that had clearly been there long enough to establish themselves. The painted lettering above the door, Millstone Kitchen, had the faint dulling that comes after a season of sun and rain. I stood there for a while, doing the math of it the way engineers do, working backward from what I could see to what must have happened, and when. I did not go inside. I drove home to Brentwood and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Ellen had bought that table at an estate sale the year we moved into the first house, the one in Murfreesboro, when we were young and did not have much. She had stripped and refinished it herself over a long weekend while I was on a job site in Chattanooga. I have moved it with us every time since then because she put her hands into it. I sat at it that afternoon and tried to understand how the opening of my son's restaurant, an event 2 years in the making, an event I had made possible with the better part of my retirement savings, had happened without me. I called Vanessa that evening. She answered on the second ring. I asked her when Millstone Kitchen had opened. There was a pause that was not quite long enough to be suspicious on its own, but that I noticed. She said the official opening had been about 8 weeks ago, that they had done a small event, just close friends and some of the farm partners they worked with. Low-key. Kyle had not wanted anything that felt like pressure. I said I understood Kyle not wanting pressure. I said that I had driven 2.5 hours to see Ellen in her final weeks every time Vanessa said Kyle would call me. He called 4 days later. He sounded exactly the way I had expected him to sound, which was tired and slightly ahead of the conversation, the way people sound when they have rehearsed it but do not feel confident in the script. He said he was sorry I had not been there for the opening. He said things had moved quickly and the timing was complicated, and he had not wanted to make a big deal of it. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him I would like to sit down with him in person, at the restaurant, at his convenience, and go through the full financial picture of where things stood. Not because I had any specific concern, because I was his father, and I had invested the money Ellen and I had spent our lives saving, and I wanted to understand where it had gone. He said he would set something up. He did not set something up. I am a methodical person by nature and profession. Ellen used to say I approached everything like a foundation inspection, testing for soft spots before I committed any weight. It is not distrust exactly. It is the habit of a man who has watched enough projects fail from hidden structural problems to know that ignoring the warning signs does not make them go away. I began going through the documents I had. I had kept everything. Every email, every wire transfer confirmation, every invoice Vanessa had forwarded over the past 18 months. I printed them all and spread them across the kitchen table and went through them in order, the way I would go through a project file when something did not add up on inspection. What I found, when I laid it all out together, rather than reviewing each piece in isolation, was a picture that had been obscured by its own volume. Individually, each invoice had seemed plausible. Collectively, the pattern was something else. There was a line item that appeared in 9 consecutive months of operating expenses. It was listed as Brand and Marketing Consulting, billed by an entity called Sycamore Creative Partners. The monthly amount was $3,400. Over 9 months, that was $30,600 billed against the restaurant's operating budget. Against my investment. I had never heard of Sycamore Creative Partners. I had seen no marketing output from Millstone Kitchen beyond a modest Instagram presence that Kyle managed himself and a listing on 2 restaurant review sites. $30,000 in consulting fees for 9 months of activity I could not identify was not a line item I was prepared to accept without an explanation. I called a former colleague, a man named Dennis, who had spent the last decade of his career doing forensic accounting work on construction disputes before retiring to Nolensville. We had worked together on a hospital project in the 90s and stayed in occasional contact. I told him I needed a favor. I told him what I had. He came over on a Saturday morning and sat at Ellen's table with a cup of coffee and went through the documents while I watched. He did not say anything for 20 minutes. Then he looked up and asked me what I knew about Sycamore Creative Partners. I told him I knew nothing. He said I should find out who registered it. It took me 3 days and a very patient woman at the Tennessee Secretary of State's office to get the answer. Sycamore Creative Partners was a limited liability company registered 14 months ago. The registered agent and sole member was a woman named Brianna. Brianna is Vanessa's younger sister. I did not call anyone. I sat with that information for 2 days, the way you sit with news that changes the shape of something you thought you understood. Brianna is 29 years old. She has a background in social media content creation. Whatever work she may have done for Millstone Kitchen, I had no evidence it was worth $30,000, and I had never been asked to approve it. I called Dennis back. I told him what I had found. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Martin, you need to put this in writing before you say a word to either of them." I spent the following week doing exactly that. I went through every document again, this time with Dennis's guidance, and we put together a clear summary of the amounts I had invested, the amounts that had been spent, and on what, and the specific line items I had not approved. The Sycamore payments were the largest single item, but they were not the only one. There were 2 equipment purchases for amounts higher than the quotes I had been shown, and a vendor credit that appeared in the invoices but not in the bank statements Dennis helped me review. When I had everything organized, I called my son. He answered on the 3rd ring. I did not ask how he was. I said I needed to meet with him and Vanessa at the restaurant, with enough time to go through some things properly. I said I would come to Nashville on a Tuesday. He asked what it was about. I said it was about the finances and that I would rather explain in person. He said okay. The drive to Nashville on that Tuesday was one of the quieter drives I can remember. I took the long way down I-65 instead of the back roads I usually prefer, and I kept the radio off. Ellen had a habit of filling quiet drives with whatever she was thinking, not chatter but thinking out loud, and sometimes when I drive in silence, I am aware of the absence of that more than I am aware of anything else. I arrived at Millstone Kitchen at 2 in the afternoon, between the lunch and dinner service. Kyle met me at the door. He had aged in the past 2 years in the way young men age when they take on more than they were ready for, which is not badly exactly, but with a new weight around the eyes. He hugged me, and it was a real hug, whatever else was happening. Vanessa was in the back office. She stood when I came in, and we shook hands, and she offered me water, which I accepted. Kyle took the chair beside her. I sat across the desk. I placed the summary Dennis and I had prepared between us, and I said, I would like to go through this together. I want to be accurate about what happened in that room over the next hour and 40 minutes, because I have thought about it carefully, and I do not want to describe it in a way that is more dramatic than it was or less honest than it deserves. Vanessa had answers for everything. She had the kind of fluency with financial explanations that comes from having prepared them in advance, and for the first 20 minutes, I could see Kyle listening to her the way you listen to someone explain something you were not quite sure about yourself. Brianna's consulting fees were legitimate, she said. Brianna had done content strategy, vendor relationship outreach, and community event planning, all of which she could document. The pricing was in line with market rates for boutique consulting services in Nashville. I asked her to show me the documentation. She said she would have her accountant compile it. I asked her to tell me, without the documentation, what specific deliverables Brianna had provided in the first 3 months of engagement, before the restaurant had even opened. There was a pause. Kyle turned his head and looked at his wife. It was a small thing. He just turned his head, but I have known my son for 37 years, and I understood that look, which was the look of a man who was hearing the answer to a question he had not known to ask. Vanessa said Brianna had been involved in the pre-opening social media build-up. Kyle said he had handled the social media himself before opening. Vanessa said Brianna had been doing background work that Kyle had not been directly involved with. Kyle said he was not aware that Brianna was being paid at all. What followed was not a fight. It was something quieter and more uncomfortable than a fight, which was 2 people arriving at different points on the same story while I sat across from them and tried to be invisible enough to let it happen. I do not take satisfaction in the memory of it. My son looked like a man discovering that the house he had built had a room in it he had never been shown. When they had finished saying what they were going to say to each other, I put both of my hands flat on the desk and I said, "Here is what I need. I need a full accounting of everything spent and what it was spent on. I need documentation of Sycamore Creative Partners and every deliverable billed to that relationship. And I need a written agreement, going forward, that any expense over $3,000 requires my written acknowledgement before it is paid. Not because I want to run this restaurant, because I need to know that the investment I made with my wife's retirement savings, with money that took us 30 years to build, is being managed honestly. Vanessa said she would need time to speak with her accountant and her attorney. I said, of course. I said I would give her 3 weeks. I stood up. I shook her hand. I did not say anything harsh, and I did not have to. Kyle walked me out to the parking lot. It was late afternoon, and the light was coming through the maple trees along the street at the angle it gets in November in Tennessee, low and amber. He had his hands in his pockets, the same way he used to stand as a teenager when he had something to say and was working up to it. He said, I didn't know about Brianna. I told him I believed that. He said, I should have been paying closer attention. I told him that was something he would need to decide how to address, not with me, but with Vanessa and with himself. He said, I'm sorry you missed the opening, Dad. I should have made sure you were there. That was wrong. I looked at my son for a long moment. There is a kind of apology that is offered to close a subject, and there is a kind of apology that costs something. This was the second kind, and I recognized the difference. I told him the restaurant was beautiful. I told him I had seen it through the window, and it looked like exactly the place he had described to me at Ellen's dining room table 2 years before. I told him his mother would have eaten there every week. He smiled in a way that did not quite make it all the way to his eyes, and we said goodbye. The 3 weeks passed. On a Thursday morning, I received an email from Vanessa's accountant with a full financial summary attached. It was thorough and clearly prepared carefully. The Sycamore Creative Partners payments totaled $32,800 across the full engagement. The accountant had included a summary of deliverables and a comparable market rate analysis. Dennis and I reviewed it over the phone that afternoon. Dennis said the documentation was real. He said Brianna had done work. He could verify that from the files. He said the question was whether the rate was justified and whether the arrangement should have required my approval before it was put in place. He said, the short version is, you were not defrauded in the legal sense, but you were not treated as a partner. Those are different problems. I thought about that for a long time. I wrote back to Vanessa's accountant. I said I accepted the accounting as presented. I said I was not pursuing any claim related to past expenditures. I attached a 1-page agreement that Dennis and I had drafted, outlining the approval threshold going forward, the requirement for quarterly financial summaries to be sent to me directly, and an acknowledgement that my investment was to be treated as a formal arrangement with the basic obligations of transparency that any investment relationship carries. I said I would need both Kyle and Vanessa to sign it. They signed it within the week. That is the part of the story that resolves most cleanly. What does not resolve as cleanly is the other part. Kyle and I talk on Sunday afternoons again. The conversations are different now than they were before all of this. More careful, more honest in some ways that I did not expect. He told me, a few weeks after the Nashville meeting, that the first months of the restaurant had been harder than he let on, that the margins were tighter than projected, and that he had been embarrassed to tell me because he was afraid I would regret the investment, and he did not want to see that in my face. I told him that regret was not how I worked. I told him I had known the risk when I wrote the check. I told him that what I needed from him was not a perfect outcome. I needed him to include me in whatever the outcome actually was. He said, you and Mom always made it look so easy. I told him we had not made it look easy. I told him we had just never made the mistake of pretending the hard parts weren't happening. I never stood in the dining room of Millstone Kitchen on the night it opened and felt the specific pride of a parent watching a child arrive at the place they were meant to be. That moment existed, and then it passed, and I was not in it. I am not going to pretend that doesn't matter to me. It does. But in March, 5 months after the meeting in the back office, Kyle called me on a Thursday and asked if I would come down for a Saturday dinner service. Not as an investor. As his father, he reserved the corner table, the one by the window that looks out onto the street, and he came out of the kitchen 3 times during the meal to sit with me for a few minutes between courses. The food was exactly what he had described to me 2 years before. Local sourcing, honest preparation, the kind of cooking that knows what it is and does not try to be anything else. At the end of the meal, Kyle brought out a small dessert I had not ordered and sat down across from me with a cup of coffee. He said, the farm we source from, out in Leiper's Fork, I'm going to do a dinner there in June. Farm table, the whole thing. I'd like you to come. I said I would be there. I drove home to Brentwood in the dark. The lights of Nashville fell behind me, and the highway opened up, and I found the quiet that long drives can give you when you stop looking for something in it. Ellen and I spent 33 years building what we built, not because we were gifted or particularly lucky, but because we showed up consistently for each other and for the work and for the people we were responsible to. We paid attention. We put things in writing when it mattered. We had difficult conversations instead of letting difficult things accumulate until they became something worse. I would say to any parent who has done what I did, given money to a child with nothing but trust to secure it, and who has begun to feel the distance that comes when trust is not reciprocated with honesty, your instincts are not the problem. The feeling that you are being managed rather than respected is information, and you are allowed to act on it. A loan between family members without documentation is not a gift of love. It is an invitation for confusion, and eventually, for the kind of hurt that is very hard to undo. A formal agreement is not a sign that you do not trust your child. It is a sign that you take the relationship seriously enough to protect it, that you believe in it enough to put it in writing, that you understand the difference between letting go and being pushed out, and you know which one you deserve. My son's restaurant is doing well. The quarterly summaries come on time. Last month, he called me before signing a contract with a new linen vendor because the amount exceeded the threshold, and he wanted my acknowledgement. That phone call, those 4 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon, meant more to me than anything that happened in the 2 years before it. I am 62 years old. I have outlasted a career and lost a wife and had the kind of conversation with my son that neither of us wanted to have and that both of us needed. I do not need to be thanked for what I contributed. I do not need a plaque or a mention on the menu. I need to be included. I need to be treated as the father I have always tried to be. There is a difference between being generous and being taken for granted. Most people who have been taken for granted by someone they love can tell you exactly the moment they understood the difference. I understood it on a sidewalk in East Nashville on a Tuesday morning in November, looking at a restaurant I had built with 30 years of savings, through a window, alone. I did something about it quietly, carefully, and without making a scene. That is what my wife would have done. That is what I owe her memory. Ask the question, read the document, take the meeting, and if the person you believed in is worth the belief, they will sit across from you at that table and work through it with you, even when it is hard. Especially when it is hard. That is what family means.